Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher, and you're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Okay, welcome back to all my friends and listeners out there. This is Jim here. Today we're going to continue in my study on the history of Christianity. Well, first of all, I love history. I think you all know that. I've read so many biographies about all the famous people in the world, from Alexander the Great to Churchill and Eisenhower and Kennedy, and it's just what I like to do. I don't necessarily call it study, but I like to read about unusual leaders like Lincoln, and even some of the more obscure leaders throughout the world, like Genghis Khan and Attila. A lot of people consider these folks barbarians, but man, they had intelligence, they had structure, and I just can't get enough of it. And when you mix history now with the beginning of the organization that saved my soul, I just think it's miraculous. And the last time I talked to you, we were somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 AD, just the destruction of Jerusalem was happening. I told you that Nero had killed himself in 68, that most of the persecution of the Christians stopped, even though, very unusually, none of the laws that Nero passed were rescinded. It's crazy. But the same thing happens in our country today. They pass laws 40, 50, 100 years ago, and some of those dumb laws are still in existence, even though they have no pertinence to today's life. Nero had passed, and then in AD 69, it was called the Year of the Four Emperors, and eventually the Emperor Vespasian gained control of the government, and during that time, his son Titus was the next in line. Domitian, he became the emperor after Titus, actually, and at first he ignored Christians, and he eventually turned against them for whatever reason. It's not really known, but he loved and respected the former traditions of his Roman predecessors, all the emperors, and he wanted to restore that respect. Now, Christians, in his opinion, because they rejected the Roman traditions and Roman gods and Roman traditions, they kind of clashed with Domitian's dreams. And that is what some people pontificate is the reason for his persecution of them. And Jews didn't have it much better either. Domitian did not like Jews at all. And ever since they destroyed the temple in AD 70, Domitian decided that all Jews were to remit to the imperial coffers the annual offering they would otherwise have sent to Jerusalem. So he's not only persecuting them, he's stealing from them. And many of the Jews said, no, we're not going to do that. And while others sent the money, Rome made it clear that they cannot send money to Jerusalem. Domitian enacted strict laws against Judaism. And since the time of Domitian, the distinction between Jews and Christians was not really clear. They considered them part of the same problems, part of the same religion, if you want to put a connotation on it. And the Roman authorities, imperial functionaries, began persecuting anybody who followed Jewish practices. So not only was he persecuting Christians, but he was now persecuting Jews. And just like Nero, it didn't appear that this persecution was uniformly severe throughout the empire. It faceted, particularly in Rome, somewhat in Asia Minor, and Flavius Clemens in Rome, his wife Flavia Domitia, who may have been related to the emperor, were executed. They were accused of Jewish practices. And since Christians worshipped an invisible God, just like Jews, Flavius Clemens and Domitia died because they were worshiping this invisible God. They were Christians. So it was pretty likely that they suffered the same result as a lot of the Roman martyrs did. Now, there were several ancient writers who affirm that there were so many martyrs back then. There was a letter, actually, that the Church of Rome addressed to the Corinthians that talked about the continuous and unexpected evils which have come upon us. That was in AD 72. In fact, in Asia Minor, the persecution of the Jews and the Christians resulted in the writing of the book of Revelation. Did you know that? John was exiled to the island of Patmos. And there were indications through Roman records that many people were killed. And for generations, the church in Asia Minor remembered the reign of this brutal dictator, Domitian, as an extreme time of trial. But right in the midst of the persecution, Revelation displayed a much more negative attitude toward Rome than the rest of the New Testament did. Paul, in his writings, instructed Christians in Rome to obey the authorities. He said this was ordained by God, and he's right. But now, John in Patmos talks about Rome as the great harlot, drunk with the blood of saints and the blood of martyrs. That's Revelation 17, 1 through 6. Now, fortunately, when persecution broke out, Domitian's reign was coming to an end. He was getting old. And like Nero, he began to be seen as a nutcase, just like Nero was. Now, his enemies were conspiring against him, just like they did against Julius Caesar. And just like Julius Caesar, he was murdered in his own palace. The Roman Senate decreed then that his name, Domitian, should be erased from every inscription. Nobody wanted any memory of him. Now, as for Christians, no one seems to have taken notice of them, and therefore they were granted a few years of relative peace. So now we move up to the persecution in the 2nd century. And I got a statement here from a guy named Ignatius of Antioch, and it says, Now I begin to be a disciple. Let fire and cross, flocks of beasts, broken bones, dismemberment come upon me, so long as I attain to Jesus Christ. It's pretty good, right? What a nice little prayer that is. So now, although the Roman Empire began persecuting Christians from the time of Nero throughout the 1st century, the details of these persecutions are scarce, unless you go to the Catholic Church, who make up lots and lots of these stories. And by the 2nd century, the records begin to show a clearer view of the issues involved in these persecutions and the attitudes of Christians towards martyrdom. And one of the best known dramatic books are The Act of the Martyrs. And that book retells the arrest, trial, and death of a lot of the different martyrs for Christianity. And there are some that are very trustworthy. There are details of trials. There are details of how they were killed. On the other hand, a number of these supposed acts of martyrs clearly come way later. They're like made-up stories, and they deserve no credit. But if you look at the early documents of Christianity, you learn of the attitude of Christians towards martyrdom and other Christian writings. The most valuable is probably a set of 7 letters that the aged Bishop Ignatius of Antioch wrote on his way for his martyrdom. Now, the 2nd century offers other glimpses into the attitude of Roman authorities because of the new faith, and in that context, the correspondence between Pliny and Trajan is very illuminating. Now, let me tell you who Pliny is. In AD 111, now let's see, this is what, 80 years after Jesus Christ, right? Pliny the Younger was appointed governor of Bithynia. Now, Bithynia is on the north shore of Turkey, which is present-day Turkey. And from various sources, it appears that Pliny was a man with a profound respect for Roman law, Roman tradition. But in Bithynia, he was governing there, and he began to deal with what was an unexpected problem. There were so many Christians in that area that Pliny declared the pagan temples and the sellers of sacrificial victims were not to deal with Christians. When somebody set up a new governor, a list of Christians, Pliny began asking for this new religion, Christianity, to become illegal. He was accusing Christians, and he had them brought before him, and he was beginning to learn of the beliefs and practices of Christians. Many of them who went before Pliny, recanted their faith. They said that they were not following that faith anymore. They had abandoned it. And Pliny required only that they pray to the gods of Rome. They burn incense before the image of the emperor. They curse Christ. And something he heard that real Christians would never do. But if they did those things and rejected Jesus Christ, he would let them go. And those who persisted in their faith, like John, he would torture. So he usually gave Christians 3 opportunities to recant. He threatened them with death. If they refused, he had them executed. Not so much for being a Christian, but for the fact that they didn't obey the governor, for their obstinacy. Now, if they were Roman citizens, he had them sent to Rome as the law required. But Pliny really considered himself a just man. So he felt obliged to find out what crimes, besides sheer obstinacy, Christians committed. And all he could learn was that Christians gathered before dawn to sing to Christ as to one of his gods, and to join in an oath not to commit, sins of theft, adultery, or any other sin for that matter. The Christians used to gather for a common meal. They actually discontinued this practice when the authorities outlawed secret meetings. So Pliny, not really convinced that this was the whole truth, put 2 female Christian ministers to torture. He killed 2 women. And the question then was, should Christians be punished for concrete crimes, or should the very name Christian be considered a crime? This is back in AD 111 now. So Pliny suspended the proceedings and wrote Emperor Trajan for further instructions so that he didn't get in trouble for what he was doing. And what did the Emperor Trajan tell him? He said, when it comes to punishment of Christians, there is no general rule that is equally valid in all circumstances. On the one hand, the nature of their crime is such that the state should not waste time seeking them out. On the other hand, if they are accused and refuse to recant their Christianity, they will be punished. Those Christians who are willing to worship the gods of Rome should be pardoned without further inquiry. Furthermore, anonymous accusations should be disregarded. They're not today, you know what I mean? If you look at what's going on with President Trump, he's been accused by anonymous sources of almost everything. And there's investigations into his sex life, his money, the Russians, I mean, one thing after another, by these anonymous sources. Anonymous sources are ridiculous, and they should be disregarded. That was very wise back then in Rome. And finally, almost 100 years later, this guy Tertullian, who was a brilliant lawyer in North Africa, rebelled against the injustice of that edict, which was still in force. Remember, these Roman emperors, when they laid down a law, very rarely was it rescinded. Here's what Tertullian said. What a necessarily confused sentence! Exclamation point. It refuses to seek them out as if they were innocent, and orders that they be punished if they were guilty. If pardoned and yet is cruel, it ignores and yet punishes. Why do you circumvent your own censure? If you condemn, why do you not inquire? And if you do not inquire, why do you not also absolve? Do you get that? So although Trajan's decisions seemed to lack any logic whatsoever, it didn't lack political sense. He understood what Pliny was saying, that Christians, by the mere fact of being Christians, weren't committing any crime against society or against the state. So, the resources of the state should not be wasted in seeking them out. Makes sense? But once accused and brought before the authority, Christians had to be forced to worship the gods of the empire. And if they didn't, they were going to face persecution. So, those Christians who openly refused to worship the Roman gods and the emperor were punished because the dignity of the Roman courts required it. And secondly, by refusing to worship the emperor, they look at it this way. Look at it from their point of view. Somebody's denying your rule, right? Even though you are in charge. So it's like a slur. It's like you're disrespecting them. You're disrespecting their right to rule. And for that, the policies which Trajan outlined in his response to Pliny were followed far beyond the borders of Bithynia and long after Trajan's death. Now, throughout the 2nd century and part of the 3rd, it was Roman policy now not to seek out Christians, but still to punish them when they were brought before the authorities. And that was true even before the correspondence between Pliny and Trajan and surrounding the letters, the 7 letters of Ignatius. So, Ignatius, interesting guy. About 107 AD, Ignatius was this elderly bishop in Antioch, the same place where Paul started, right? He was condemned to death by the imperial authorities And during that time, great festivities were planned in Rome in celebration of their military victory. Ignatius was sent to the capital so that his death would amuse the Romans. So now on his way to Rome, he writes 7 letters. And those 7 letters are available today. It's really the earliest documents and knowledge of early Christianity. He was born about the time that Jesus was put to death, around 30 AD. And he was, well into his 70s by the time he was martyred. Now, in his letters, he repeatedly called himself the bearer of gods, as if this was a title which was known or should be known by all Christians. And later, by making a slight change in the Greek text of his letters, people began speaking of Ignatius as he who was born by God. So a legend rose around this Ignatius, to which, when he was a little child, who in the 2nd century had great prestige in the Christian community because he was a bishop. And a bishop was second after the apostles. Now, nothing's known about the arrest and trial of Ignatius. Nobody knows who it was that brought the accusation against him. But from his letters, it's clear that there were several factions in Antioch, and that the elderly bishop had tenaciously opposed those doctrines that he found heretical. Now, it's not clear whether he was accused before the authorities by a pagan or by a dissident Christian who sought to undo him. In any case, for one reason or another, Ignatius was arrested, tried, and condemned to die in Rome. And on their way to Rome, Ignatius and the soldiers guarding him passed through Asia Minor. A number of Christians from that area went out to see him. Ignatius was able to see them and converse with them. He even had a Christian who wrote letters that he dictated. And it's clear from those letters that there was no general persecution of Christians throughout the entire empire at this time, but that only those brought before the courts were condemned. So they weren't seeking out Christians, but if one was brought before the court, they would take care of it. So this is why Ignatius could receive visitors just like Paul, who were obviously guilty of the same crime that he was guilty of. So Ignatius' 7 letters are the outcome of those visits. He'd received the bishops, he'd received a couple of elders, he received a deacon from the church in Magnesia. From Tralles, Bishop Polybius had come. Ephesus had sent a delegation. There was a bishop called Osinemus, who was probably the same person Paul wrote to Philemon or Philemon. And to each of these churches, Ignatius addressed a letter, just like Paul did, from Smyrna. And later from Tralles, he wrote 3 other letters, one to the church of Smyrna, another to Bishop Polycarp, and a third to the church in Philadelphia. But the most significant letter, to help us understand the nature of the persecution and the martyrdom in the 2nd century, is the one Ignatius wrote from Smyrna to the church in Rome. Now, this is interesting. Somehow, Ignatius had heard that Christians in Rome were considering the possibility of freeing him from death. He didn't look upon that favorably. He was ready to seal his witness with blood. He wanted to be martyred. And any move on the part of the Christians in Rome to save him would be an obstacle to his goal. So he wrote them this: I fear your kindness, which may harm me. Do you believe that? You may be able to achieve what you plan through his release, but if you pay no heed to my request, it will be very difficult for me to attain unto God. He wanted to be martyred. And as Ignatius goes on to say, his purpose is to be an imitator of the passion of Jesus Christ. So as he faces this ultimate sacrifice, Ignatius believes that he begins to become a disciple. And all he wants from the Christians in Rome is that they pray for him, not that he be freed, but he may have the strength to face what he's going to face. So that I may not only be called a Christian, but be crucified. He says, I no longer savor corruptible food, but wish to taste the bread of God, which is the flesh of Jesus Christ, and his blood I wish to drink. Now, he says, when I suffer, I shall be free in Jesus Christ, and with him shall rise again in freedom. I am God's wheat, to be ground by the teeth of beasts, so that I may be offered as pure bread of Christ. This is where the church is now starting to get into some metaphysical stuff, right? Some really weird stuff. He goes on, and the reason why he's willing to face death with such courage is that, listen to what he says, if you remain silent about me, I shall become a word of God. But if you allow yourselves to be swayed by love for me, in which you hold my flesh, I shall again be no more than a human voice. You find that interesting? I do. And then a little bit later, this bishop from Smyrna, Polycarp, wrote to the Christians in Philippi, asking what's going on with Ignatius. The answer from them was that he was killed. And you know what? He wasn't martyred. He died unexpectedly shortly after his arrival in Rome. Next teaching, I'm going to tell you about this new guy, Polycarp. And we're going to really get into the beginning of what eventually becomes the Catholic Church. Polycarp comes around the year 155 AD. And we'll talk about him a little bit later. That's going to do it for today's teaching. Hope you enjoyed that. I am Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. You're listening to the Bible Exposition channel. Hope you all have a great day. God bless. Hey, this is Jim Sedore. I am your personal Bible teacher. If you like what you hear, and you think your friends and relatives would benefit by the teaching, please share it with everyone you know. Thanks, and have a great day.